Cultivation+Farming+No CP, ding. The Puyang grass you planted can increase the success rate of alchemy by 1, ding. Congratulations. Successfully obtained your first spiritual seed. Ding. Li Sui'an, who has traveled through the realm of cultivation, is very helpless. Others have traveled through talismans, alchemy, and heavenly spiritual routes. She started her journey by farming. Fortunately, the revised version of Happy Farm was launched online. Farming is also good, the order has been punctured again. Keywords of the novel. Changsheng. I am a farmer in the cultivation world without a pop-up window. Changsheng. I am a farmer in the cultivation world. Download the complete text. Changsheng. I am a farmer in the cultivation world. Latest chapter reading. Chapter 1. Revised version of Happy Farm. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Revised version of Happy Farm North Wilderness Immortal Cultivation Realm, Huayuan Valley. This is the territory of the Northern Wilderness Qingyang sect, famous for the spiritual fields that were extensively cultivated by their predecessors. In the scorching sun, Li Sui'an stood in a wilderness, sweat slipping from her forehead to her chin, and she couldn't help but burst out with a bitter smile. As is well known, the most miserable way to become a cultivator in the world of immortality is through scattered cultivation, while the ones who have not yet gained freedom are the miscellaneous disciples. Li Sui'an is one of them. But who can tell me that when a servant disciple cultivates land, he cultivates it, why does he still need to cultivate his own spiritual field? Shouldn't Huayuan Valley be all cultivated spiritual fields? Just now, Li Sui'an woke up from the body of this 12-year-old, immortal orphan. She learned that her parents had died for the sect and that the sect had made an exception by bringing her as a miscellaneous spiritual root into the sect. Her heart was filled with joy. I thought I was the destined protagonist, but reality gave her a headshot blow first. The outer disciples and miscellaneous disciples of Qingyang sect had to engage in production, and there was no novel that had a lot of time for cultivation and outdoor experience. Even inner disciples need to regularly complete sect tasks in order to obtain basic resources for cultivation. The miscellaneous disciples cultivate, breed, mine, and hand over 70% of the results to the sect. The disciples from outside the sect who cultivate various skills in immortality also have to hand over a certain amount to the sect. They are all the oppressed bottom of the cultivation world. But at such a low level, there are also many people who are eager to come in and practice. Becoming a so-called fairy. Fortunately, Li Sui'an's original parents exchanged her poor spiritual roots for her death to enter the Qingyang sect. Unfortunately, due to her parents being also miscellaneous disciples, she was given an uncultivated spiritual land. If it weren't for her starting cultivation at the age of 6 and entering the realm of qi cultivation at the age of 12, she wouldn't have felt the faint spiritual energy in this 5-acre spiritual land. Li Sui'an gritted his teeth and dug straight down with a hoe. Fortunately, there was no need to hand over the products to the sect in the first year, or perhaps the sect never thought that someone could learn planting spells and effectively plant them in the first year. Lingtian has both good and bad qualities. For example, Li Sui'an's 5 acres of land, even if cultivated, are not considered mainstream Lingtian, and the grade level is simply beyond reach. Want to plant lingmi? Even the worst lingmi can't do it. What should I do if I ask? By using the technique of spiritual rain, you can plant the worst types of millet seeds when you have received them. System. Panel. Golden finger. Sesame, open the door. Li Sui'an waved his hoe in an attempt to light up his skills in this way. However, there was no response at all. The system is not working today. Suddenly, Li Sui'an lowered his head and continued to wave the hoe in his hand. Meet the conditions. The cultivation version of Happy Farm will be launched. Ding. Own a non-mainstream spiritual field. You can plant useful plants. Puyang Grass, Molly Grass. A few lines of writing suddenly popped up in her mind, making her exclaim in surprise. My cheat! It's finally here. Although others have powerful systems for increasing proficiency and distributing big gift packages, she doesn't expect to have any powerful cheats at the beginning like this. As long as there is. That's it. We are not picky eaters. Isn't it just being a farmer? Compared to going to fight and kill, I accidentally lost my life, and farming seems to be not that bad. Sui'an happily opened the panel of Happy Farm, only to realize that it didn't seem as simple as farming as she thought. Realistic version of Happy Farm, host. Sui'an, Spirit Root. 5 Spirit Roots, miscellaneous, cultivation. Cultivate 1 layer of Qi, practice. 5 elements cultivation technique, yellow level lower level. First level, 4% per 100%, spell. None, Lingtian. Half an acre does not flow, contains spiritual energy. 12% per 100%, seed spirit. None, go and learn the magic related to planting. You're not even good at planting. Sui'an was taken aback for a moment, then wanted to see if there were any other pages, but after looking around, he found nothing. Is Happy Farm just a farm? She dug out the storage bag left by her parents in her arms and took out 2 booklets and some seeds inside. One book is a cultivation technique, the 5 elements cultivation technique, and the other book is naturally a spell issued by the sect specifically for farming. There are a total of 5 spells, the earth-type spell. The moistening earth technique, used to nourish the spiritual field. Water system technique. Spirit rain technique, used to irrigate spiritual plants. Grass system technique. Foraging technique, used to promote seedling growth and cultivate seedlings. Metal technique. Sharp and resilient technique, used for weeding and cultivation. And the final fire technique, the sunshine technique, is used to avoid seedling death caused by extreme weather. Sui'an knew without looking at the panel that he had not learned any of the original techniques. He didn't know if his qualifications were too poor or if something was wrong, so he handed it over to her without any skills. After some consideration, Sui'an decided to sow the seeds on this half-acre of cultivated land first. After all, the sect doesn't pay any salary, and she only has 2 spirit stones left by her parents all over her body for support. I dare not take it out easily, fearing that someone will kill someone for wealth. The system just said that the most suitable land for planting Puyang Grass and chestnut grass is. Puyang Grass is an auxiliary material for the first order elixir of nourishing Qi, and its price is not high or low. Mali grass is the main raw material for making talismans and ink. In this comparison, Sui'an directly sprinkled Puyang Grass into the spiritual field. Then, facing a wasteland, he began to learn the technique of sharpness and resilience. Since the sect did not collect crops in the first year, it is natural to leave enough time for them to learn spells and use them for hand farming, which is really a waste of time. Quickly, an afternoon passed, and Sui'an's sweat couldn't help but moisten his back, finally successfully performing the sharp resilience technique. Looking at the faint spiritual energy emanating from a square meter of spiritual field, she also felt a sense of achievement in her heart. Ding! Practice sharp resilience technique diligently for an afternoon, reward sharp resilience technique proficiency plus 1%, spell. Blade resilience, beginner 1% per 100%, Sui'an was taken aback for a moment, and in that moment, she felt like she had practiced the sharp resilience technique many times again. She was both surprised and delighted, just say it. How could her golden fingers only serve as cultivation records? Although this body's qualifications are too poor, as long as she perseveres, she can always make progress. I originally wanted to learn another spiritual rain technique in one breath, but when I saw that the sky was already dark. Haste makes waste. Go back to the house to practice. The room was right next to the Lingtian, and she took out the remaining low-quality lingmi and cooked it all to eat. This is a super luxurious thing for the original owner, but Sui'an knows that if he wants the horse to run, he must let the horse eat grass. Eating and drinking enough is the key to better cultivation. A large bowl of spiritual rice was eaten, and Sui'an dared not waste it. He quickly sat down and began to absorb spiritual energy. The 5 elements cultivation technique operates within the body and begins to cultivate these spiritual energies. After a while, Sui'an was pleasantly surprised and opened his eyes. This time, his cultivation was 10 times faster than before. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Lingbao Pavilion in Slums. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Lingbao Pavilion in Slums. As a cultivator, meditation can completely replace sleeping, but with Sui'an's body, the spiritual energy absorbed by meditating with spiritual rice for an hour is already saturated. However, this time, Sui'an did not wait for the system's reward. She couldn't help but be disappointed for a while, but the thought that if meditation were also rewarded, her strength would grow even faster than those arrogant people, which was completely unrealistic. Sui'an couldn't stay idle at all and ran to the newly planted spiritual field to try practicing the spiritual rain technique. The moon is shining brightly, and the girl stands in the middle of the spiritual field, pinching the formula with her hands. Her eyebrows furrow tightly, trying to use her spiritual energy to gather the rain clouds around her. Suddenly, she fell directly to the ground. Her spiritual energy had already been depleted, but the gathered rain clouds dissipated in an instant, not even a single raindrop fell. Sui'an's mouth twitched, and she didn't believe it anymore. She immediately began to meditate in place to regain her spiritual energy. Time and time again. As dawn approached, she exhaled a mouthful of turbid air, and the rain clouds gathered in the air finally covered half an acre of spiritual field and scattered spiritual rain. Finally made it. Ding. Work hard to practice the Lingyu technique. Reward Lingyu technique proficiency plus 1%, ding. Successfully cast the entry-level spirit rain technique once, spiritual field spiritual energy plus 1%, Sui'an was taken aback. He had previously known that the spirit rain technique was not only used to water crops, but also to care for spiritual fields. I didn't expect it to have this effect. When she wanted to use the spirit rain technique again, the system also gave the answer. Ding. To avoid causing water damage to the spiritual field and damaging the quality, please irrigate according to the amount, once a day. Sure enough, cultivating a spiritual field requires more than just using the spirit rain technique. Sui'an pursed her lips, just as she was touching her chin and thinking. The boy on the other side of her spiritual field fence approached. I just saw you use the spirit rain technique. Have you learned the sharp resilience technique? Help me cultivate and cultivate land. A boy about her age walked over the fence with a smooth tongue. Sui'an looked at his face and thought for a while before pulling this person out of his memory. He is Zhang Yan. His mother was also a miscellaneous disciple, not very old, with a low cultivation level. When she arrived, she only practiced qi on the 2nd level. Zhang Yan has only just introduced qi into her body until now. Not to mention any techniques. Manually cultivate wasteland every day just like before. Sui'an blinked and said, well, it depends on the situation. I've already finished everything here, and I can help you with the remaining time, but the compensation will be fine. For Zhang Yan, she doesn't care, after all, they are all pitiful people, and she also needs to practice these spells. Upon hearing this, Zhang Yan immediately narrowed his eyes and said, I understand, thank you. You are such a good person. By the way, let me tell you a secret. You don't know if you don't have any neighbors over there. My aunt next door told me that the butler will come to check the situation these days. After speaking, his eyes dimmed as he looked at Sui'an's newly planted half-acre of Puyang Grass. She couldn't help but furrow her brows. She had some influence on the steward in her memory, and used the free magic of the sect to cheat away a spirit stone from her original body. You should know that a spirit stone can be exchanged for 1 kilogram of first-class quality spirit rice, and inferior spirit rice can be exchanged for 10 kilograms. Li Sui'an naturally sensed that Zhang Yan was intentionally or unintentionally pointing towards the half-acre of Puyang Grass. It seems that the butler is not kind this time. But just this morning, due to the washing of the rain, small tender buds sprouted one after another. She really couldn't bear to pull them out. It doesn't matter to think of Li Sui'an. Troops for the enemy, earth for floods, but she doesn't believe that he can rob her of half an acre. At dawn, she returned to the thatched cottage to take a nap before planning to visit a small market in Huayuan Valley. Unlike her original form, if she wants to cultivate, she must consume spiritual rice, even if it is of lower quality. The small markets in Huayuan Valley are mostly products left by spiritual cultivators after handing them over to the sect, but there are also many miscellaneous disciples and outsiders from the sect who come to sell some things. Then buy some high-quality Ling crops at a low price. Talismans. First-level talismans. Little friend. This nourishing pill is a good thing. Do you want to take a look? As soon as he entered the market, Li Sui'an felt as if he had walked into a rural gathering in his past life. The market is very small, just a 100-meter-long street with scattered shops on both sides. Most of them sell and purchase daily necessities such as wealth, rice, oil, and salt, while the actual sales of some cultivation products are pitiful. This is very normal. Although Huayuan Valley is not within the Qingyang sect, it still belongs to the Qingyang sect. No Sanshio has the courage to seek trouble. Moreover, most of the people living in this area are disciples of qi cultivation during the cultivation period. Apart from 70% of the crops collected by the sect, the remaining ones are only enough to make a living. Who has the ability to purchase more martial arts materials? Li Sui'an ignored these street vendors and walked straight into the Lingbao Pavilion, set up by the sect. Although Lingbao Pavilion is located in Huayuan Valley, its contents are still quite comprehensive. Not only are there some spells and techniques, but also some low-level talismans and elixirs. It's just a comparison. Li Sui'an even saw an umbrella-type inferior magical tool. Well, it's very confusing, and the price is also very high, a total of 20 inferior spirit stones. She deeply doubted whether this magic weapon had been displayed here since the store was opened, serving as a storefront. After all, the farmers in Huayuan Valley don't have the money to purchase magical tools. Li Sui'an, who withdrew his gaze, walked straight to the counter. Behind the counter was a dozing middle-aged man with a gentle face. It seems that the work at the Lingbao Pavilion is quite tiring. Look, I fell asleep in broad daylight. Li Sui'an lightly tapped on the desk of the counter. Gao Yu. What do you want to buy? Suddenly sobering up, the middle-aged cultivator looked at Li Sui'an displeased, as if Li Sui'an had disturbed him while he was fishing at work. Boss, I want to buy some inferior spiritual rice. By the way, are there any pill or talisman techniques here that I can take a look at? After listening, the middle-aged cultivator looked at her gray and old clothes, and a hint of disdain and ridicule flashed through her eyes. He politely and distantly said, "How much do you want per kilogram of inferior spirit rice and 100 spirit beads?" As for martial arts, there are naturally some, but the price is not cheap. Li Sui'an raised her eyebrows slightly, and she naturally knew what middle-aged cultivators meant. It's nothing but poverty, don't ask if you don't have money. She believes that with the existence of a system, she can definitely become an agricultural tycoon. After all, Happy Farm naturally focuses on farming. Everyone knows how to make money with pills and talismans. She wants to learn more advanced techniques that can improve the quality of the spiritual field, and definitely needs money. Li Sui'an took out a spirit stone and placed it on the table, saying with a smile, 10 pounds of spirit rice. The middle-aged cultivator glanced at it and silently put away the spirit stone. He took out several martial arts books from the shelf and said, "I'll go get you the spirit rice. These are all the martial arts in our store, you can choose one first." Before leaving, he also placed a book called Spiritual Tonifying Technique on it. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Rules are rules. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Rules are rules. Upon seeing this, Sui'an felt a sense of joy in her heart. As soon as the middle-aged cultivator left, she began to flip over. After a while, she let go of the spiritual nourishment technique in disappointment. It's not as if she could replenish the spiritual energy in the spiritual field as she thought. Practicing it to a great extent can only accelerate meditation time. To put it simply, the chicken rib technique. The release of spells in the early stage of qi cultivation can easily cause a deficiency of spiritual energy in the body, and this book is indeed useful. It is not very useful, and it is not worth the price of a spirit stone marked on it. Flipping down, I found that only one book was somewhat useful. The Secret Technique of Nurturing Spirits. Sui'an flipped through a few pages and found that this secret technique was in ruins, but the content on it really caught her attention. All things have spirits, they can nourish spirits. In one sentence, the essence was expressed directly. Ding! A broken cultivation technique that can be used for breeding has been detected. Do you want to repair the first level technique? A seed spirit is required. The sound of the system appeared, and she froze in place. What? Can you repair the technique? Although it is not yet known what spirit cultivation is, the repair technique may already be exaggerated. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator walked over and took out 10 kilograms of spirit rice. Looking at the broken cultivation technique she was holding in her hand, a smile appeared on her face. You have such a good eye. This skill is incredibly mysterious. Today, I have a chance with you to take away 2 spirit stones. Sui'an twitched his lips and looked at the technique in his hand. Why don't you go grab it? Black-hearted merchants. Do you sell 2 spirit stones for a broken martial arts book? She took the lingmi directly and walked outside the store. A middle-aged cultivator's urgent shout came from behind. Little friend. 1 piece. 1 piece is fine. Sui'an's heart twitched as he stopped and said, 500 spirit beads. I thought there was still some bargaining to be done, but the middle-aged cultivator agreed directly. Jiao. Lost. Sui'an left Lingbao Pavilion, and the middle-aged cultivator sat on a rocking chair, squinting his eyes slightly. Well, it's still a newcomer who can be easily fooled. I sold 500 spirit beads for a broken martial arts book that nobody wanted. He could not help but steal the window and look in the direction of Sui'an, then took out an identical copy of the broken kung fu and put it on the shelf. Sui'an walked out of the Lingbao Pavilion and curled her lips. Although she was tricked by a middle-aged cultivator, she also earned blood. The system's ability to repair this cultivation method means that the money has not been wasted, and from the overview of this cultivation method, it can be seen that it is not bad, which is several levels higher than the 5 elements cultivation technique. After buying her cultivation techniques and spiritual rice, she has also purchased all her cultivation supplies. Mainly because of her limited family background, she can't resist her extravagance. She couldn't afford magic clothes, attack spells, defense spells, or even first-order spiritual rice seeds. Sui'an returned home. Before she could cook a pot of fragrant rice, she saw Zhang Yan kneeling in front of a middle-aged greasy cultivator outside the house. She quickly stepped forward a few hundred meters before hearing their conversation. Steward. According to the sex regulations, taxes will not be collected in the first year. Please, let me have a way out. Zhang Yan kowtowed his head to the ground with tears on his face, and soon Sui'an saw a blush on his forehead. I saw the butler snort softly and said with great dignity, "The sect has its own regulations, and Huayuan Valley has its own regulations. You have already cultivated half an acre of land, why not ask you to provide half of the products of 5 acres of land before this year?" Sui'an couldn't help but frown. She also understood that the butler was not only staring at farmers like her who had already sown seeds into the spiritual field. I also targeted someone like Zhang Yan who hasn't even learned any techniques yet. Even so openly and openly. What else did Zhang Yan want to say? He opened his mouth and obediently lowered his head. Upon seeing the situation, the butler snorted coldly and walked straight towards Sui'an. "Sui'an, the same goes for you," said the butler. "Perhaps I have been deceived by a spirit stone before, and the servant in charge is quite amiable. The steward's name is Wang Zhenan, and when he brought them over earlier, he agreed that the undeveloped spiritual fields in this area would be under his jurisdiction. Although Wang Zhenan is greedy for money, upon careful consideration, a small steward dare not say that this is the rule of Huayuan Valley. It seems that there is someone else who is making things difficult for them." Sui'an bowed before saying, "Steward, may I ask who set the rules?" The butler's face changed and he shouted loudly, "Rules are rules." After speaking, the pressure of practicing qi for 5 layers directly fell on Sui'an. Suddenly, Sui'an knelt down on one knee without any resistance. A bloody smell hit her throat, and she spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. "Humph. I came to collect taxes this year. If anyone loses 1 particle, next year's taxes won't be 80%. After speaking, Wang Zhenan shook his sleeves and left directly. Sui'an looked up towards the direction of Wang Zhenan's departure and couldn't help but clench his fists a bit. It seems that farming alone is not enough. 50% this year and 80% next year. The steward of Huayuan Valley has a great appetite. In the first year, the sect exempted taxes, and they had to pay 50% of the filial piety to Huayuan Valley. In the future, they not only had to pay 70% to the sect, but also had to pay 10% of the filial piety to Huayuan Valley. Farming. I have to die. Zhang Yan was startled and quickly came over, saying, "Sui'an. Are you okay? You can't ask that. There are also external butlers above the miscellaneous butlers, and what they dislike the most is talking about these things. You have a dull temperament, and you don't know either." Sui'an raised his eyebrows, casually wiped the blood stains from the corners of his mouth, and stood up. It seems that this external steward usually likes to sing a white face, after all, he is the person in charge of Huayuan Valley. I still disdain to challenge these little shrimp like them. Returning to the thatched cottage, thinking of today's shame, Sui'an clenched his fist and activated the 5 elements cultivation technique inside his body. 2 hours later, she finally opened her eyes. Faced with the tax on 5 acres of land, she had no choice but to rush to the spiritual field and cultivate all 5 acres one by one. This cultivation lasted for 3 days. And she also discovered that there were proficiency rewards besides using blade resilience and spirit rain spells for the first time. After every 100 attempts, there will be a reward of 1%. 1 acre of spiritual field requires her to use around 600 sharp resilience techniques, and the remaining 4 acres of spiritual field provide her with 29% proficiency. How did she get the remaining 5 points? Of course, she worked hard on it herself. Every time she emptied her spiritual energy and filled it up again, she found that it was even faster than her normal cultivation. All the seeds of Puyang Grass were sown, leaving only 10 square meters of open space. Sui'an squinted his eyes and began irrigating this 10 square meter spiritual field with the technique of spiritual rain. The second time I wanted to irrigate, I found that I didn't receive any system prompts. That is to say, the spiritual fields without crops can really be maintained with the spiritual rain technique. Although the effect is minimal, it can indeed be done this way. With 100 swings, one can achieve 1% proficiency, and the demand for Lingyu in a 10 square meter Lingtian is not high. Completely saved her the time to meditate and restore her spiritual energy. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Where is it so easy to learn? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Where is it so easy to learn? Sui'an repeatedly cast the small-range spirit rain technique into a 10 square meter spiritual field. Seeing the absence of a system prompt, she was overjoyed and became even more reckless. The spiritual energy in her body was quickly depleted, and she had no choice but to sit cross-legged and start restoring it. Ding! Warning! Warning! There is too much water. Lingtian is overwhelmed. Sui'an, who was meditating to regain his spiritual energy, was startled by this prompt and jumped up directly. She pursed her lips and rubbed her chin, staring at the 10 square meter spiritual field in front of her. It seems that this loophole cannot be exploited either. The constant loss of spiritual energy in front of her really made her difficult. Let's not worry, this 10 square meter spiritual field is probably useless. The spiritual field continuously loses spiritual energy to the outside, and over time, even the best spiritual field will become ordinary soil and no longer be able to plant spiritual objects. But don't worry, she didn't study agriculture in her previous life and really didn't know how to handle this kind of thing. Just as Sui'an was covering his head in distress, Zhang Yan nearby saw that Sui'an's spiritual field had been fully cultivated, and the planted Puyang grass had sprouted tender green buds. He swallowed his saliva and cautiously walked over. Sui'an sister. Sui'an was frowning in distress, and when he looked up, he saw Zhang Yan with a bent waist. Sister Sui'an, are you still busy? You promised me before that you would help me cultivate a spiritual field after I finished my work. Zhang Yan rubbed her hands together, her face ashamed, as if she had mustered up a lot of courage. She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows. Last time Zhang Yan asked for her help, she casually agreed. But last time the other party was far less restrained. She sighed secretly, probably because what Zhang Yan said earlier was to find a topic with her. Now that Wang Zhenan has set a mission, I have to turn to her for help. Sui'an squinted his eyes and smiled, sure. But I haven't learned the other 3 spells yet, so I may not be able to help you much. Upon hearing this, Zhang Yan immediately bent down and thanked for half a day. Turning his head, he noticed that a 10 square meter spiritual field had been flooded and couldn't help but feel regretful, saying, Sister Sui'an, this cannot be restored without the technique of using the sun to restore this land. Alas, it's a pity. After speaking, he continued solemnly, Sister Sui'an. The more spiritual rain, the better. The soil is too poor to absorb so much spiritual energy and water. Sui'an was taken aback and thought of the Zhaoyang technique that Zhang Yan had just mentioned. Quickly asked, can the sun shining technique solve the problem of soil damage? Suddenly surprised, Zhang Yan was completely bewildered. Yes, I guess so. I'm not sure either. I've heard my mother grumble like that before. The parents of her predecessor did not deal with the losses caused by Lingtian Shuilao, nor did they leave her a complete set of farming books. Naturally, she doesn't understand how to handle it. Sui'an patted Yan's frail shoulder and said, thank you. Tomorrow I will go and cultivate the land for you. After speaking, he directly took out the spells of the Zhaoyang technique and practiced them. Zhang Yan glanced at her and muttered as she walked, how could magic be so easy to learn? But magic is really easy for her to learn. As long as she accidentally casts it once, even if it doesn't have much effect, she can still gain 1% proficiency. With this 1%, she can stack up her proficiency with frequency. Nature has to study harder and practice 100 times faster than others. If we say that this cultivation may slow down due to the superiority or inferiority of spiritual roots, but spells do not exist. Sui'an sat cross-legged in front of Lingtian, carefully flipping through the Zhaoyang spell, and she also gained a basic understanding of this spell. The Zhaoyang technique, named after it, condenses the fire attribute spiritual energy in the air and evenly releases it in the spiritual field. To put it simply, if there is too much water, just shine on it with the sun and let it dry. Generally speaking, the sun shining technique is used to protect spiritual plants from freezing damage in extremely cold conditions. But at first glance, there is a bit of scientific reason why it can solve the current situation. How could you forget such a simple truth while staying in the cultivation world for 2 days? Li Sui'an hooked his lips and pinched the fire spirit root inside the Dharma technique, restless and eager to suck the fire spirit chi in the air. The spiritual energy of the fire attribute gradually condenses due to the shining yang technique, converging into a small firelight. She used her mind technique to infuse the technique of shining yang into the spiritual field. Pop! In just 1 second of contact with the spiritual field, the flames scattered and did not enter the spiritual field at all. Failed. Ding! Work hard to practice the sunlight technique. The proficiency of sunlight technique plus 1%, in the next moment, a small detail that she had not noticed before entered her mind. It was as if she had practiced the kneading technique many times day and night. These hardships seem to exist in reality, and the time and spiritual energy that can be consumed are submerged in an instant. Li Sui'an slowly exhaled a breath. This time she stood up with confidence, directly consuming the spiritual energy in her body and condensing a fireball several times larger than before. The fireball did not scatter this time, but directly penetrated into the spiritual field. The spiritual energy that had been dissipating was firmly locked in the soil, and even a small part of the spiritual energy brought by the previous spiritual rain technique remained inside. Li Sui'an clapped her hands. She was indeed a genius. In just a few days, she learned 3 out of 5 spells. Just ask. Who else is there? However, even if she is a genius, it will take a long time for these 3 spells to pass the introductory stage. Cultivating immortality is indeed difficult. Next, Li Sui'an was not in a hurry and carefully examined whether there were any weeds growing in these 5 acres of land. Due to the spiritual energy in the soil, weeds naturally compete with Puyang Grass for spiritual energy and emerge. This requires sharpness and resilience techniques to handle. She treated the weeds bit by bit with the sharp resilience technique, and then looked at the booklet of the moisturizing technique again. Generally speaking, the technique of moistening soil only has the function of maintaining the spiritual field, and it does not play a significant role in the beginner stage, or even the proficient stage. It's not as good as the daily spiritual rain technique providing more spiritual energy to the spiritual field. This also led to the fact that the farmers at the bottom did not even incorporate soil moistening techniques into their daily cultivation scope, including the original parents. Li Sui'an couldn't help but smack his lips as he looked at the booklet. Practicing this soil moistening technique to perfection can even enhance the quality of the spiritual field. Others may think it takes time, but she doesn't mind it. She spent the whole afternoon studying the technique of moistening the soil, until it was dark. Zhang Yan looked at Li Sui'an, who was cross-legged and reading in the distance, and couldn't help but shake her head. I'll just say, Zhaoyang art is not so easy to learn. I haven't learned the simplest Lingyu art and blade resilience art yet. He pounded his waist, which was sore from cultivating the spiritual field for a whole day, and walked into the thatched cottage. At this moment, Li Sui'an sat up fiercely. I understand. The main core of soil moistening technique is to fill the soil with soil spiritual energy, causing it to undergo a qualitative transformation. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Cutting off human and financial roads. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Cutting off human and financial roads. Li Sui'an stood up excitedly. Compared to the spirit rain technique, the moisturizing earth technique was indeed much more difficult. She pondered for a while before she could roughly understand the meaning of those obscure and difficult words. Ding. Work hard to practice moisturizing earth technique. Moisturizing earth technique proficiency plus 1%, ding. Successfully cast the entry-level soil moistening technique once. Spirit field spirit chi plus 1%, after savoring the entire process of moistening the soil, Sui'an squinted his eyes. Adding the previous spiritual rain technique, which resulted in an increase in spiritual energy in the spiritual field, this 10 square meter spiritual field already has 2% spiritual energy. She released another soil moistening technique on this area, and after careful observation, she found no problems. The system also did not prompt. She couldn't help but be overjoyed as she was about to come up with the final spell of urging grass. When he mastered the only 5 techniques with one go, his stomach made a gurgling sound. Sui'an only then realized that the sky had already darkened. How do you feel like taking the postgraduate entrance exam in your past life? Returning to the thatched cottage, she cooked a pot of fragrant rice, and after finishing the meal, she began to meditate and practice. The next day, she cleared the weeds in the spiritual field early and used the spiritual rain technique before carrying a hoe and walking towards Zhang Yan's field with a face full of spring breeze. In her research, she found that directly using the sharp resilience technique to cultivate spiritual fields or weed consumes a huge amount of spiritual energy, and it takes time continuously. On the contrary, releasing the blade resilience technique on the hoe, the speed is not too tight, and the spiritual energy used is also reduced. Sui'an's sister. Before she could approach, Zhang Yan rolled up her pants and waved his hand to greet her. Seeing him still using the most primitive methods to cultivate the spiritual field, Sui'an couldn't help but shake his head. Because her predecessor also cultivated spiritual fields in this way, she still has some say. A spiritual field with spiritual energy in the cultivation world, even if it is a wasteland, is extremely difficult without using some techniques. And Wang Zhenan directly asked them to turn in their spiritual crops in the first year, which didn't give them time to practice their spells at all. You go practice the sharp resilience technique. I'll do the rest. Sui'an waved his hand. Zhang Yan immediately blushed and lowered his head, stumbling and saying, "Well, I'm so sorry about that. Let me join you." After speaking, with a hoe swung down, only a little adobe was broken on the wasteland, and the black soil did not leak out at all. She twitched her lips and hurriedly said, "With just your speed, it's not possible to cultivate it all in a month. You go practice the sharp resilience technique. By the way, remember to keep an eye on my monthly meal. Just mix some spirit rice." It's not that she's too enthusiastic, but she also needs to practice spells anyway, and it's the same no matter how she practices, and she can still enjoy a meal. You should know that most of her spirit stones have been spent, and this batch of Puyang Grass will take another 3 months to mature. But according to her way of eating, her 10 pounds of lingmi can bottom out in a month. Zhang Yan knew early on that she had learned the technique of sharpness and resilience, and it was not a big deal to exchange labor for food. At this moment, an elderly woman approached the border fence of Zhang Yan Lingtian. The large mole on the edge of the mouth is unforgettable. Yo! Xiaoyan has found someone to help cultivate the wasteland. Does this person know the technique of sharpness and resilience? He shouldn't be a half-hearted person, right? You might as well listen to Auntie. I'll help you plant this land, and then you can share 2/3 of my spiritual crops with me. Sui'an narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at Zhang Yan, whose face was as red as blood due to anger or something. She remained silent, and if Zhang Yan was willing to find someone else to plant this land, she didn't mind. When I first came here, I didn't know whether the other side had any attack magic when I saw that it was an old oil slicker in this area. There's no need to offend someone because of this. Zhang Yan raised her head and smiled slightly, saying, "Auntie, I really don't want to trouble you. I can't offer 2/3 of the reward for another one. The lady's face changed dramatically and she snorted softly, "I don't know what's going on. Don't come to me if you can't hand over the spiritual crops then." After speaking, the fat body turned around and walked towards its own field. "I made you laugh." Sui'an waved his hand, raised his eyebrows and asked, "She looks like an old fogey in this area. You are not afraid to offend her?" Zhang Yan was stunned, and then asked, "What is an old greaseball?" "It's nothing. I'm not afraid of offending, I'm afraid of death. After handing over half of the spiritual crops and distributing them to her, I'll have to die sooner or later." Sui'an fell silent. Indeed, in this clearly cannibalistic cultivation world, they were the bottom layer that could be exploited by anyone. I couldn't help but look up at Zhang Yan. Applying the technique of toughness to the hoe, she began to cultivate wasteland and meditate to restore the cycle of spiritual energy. Until the sun rose 3 times, she not only successfully cultivated 1 acre of spiritual field, but also increased her proficiency in blade and resilience technique to 38%. The release speed of blade resilience has also increased significantly compared to the beginning. Sui'an wiped the fine beads of sweat on his forehead and said, "That's it for today. You sow the seeds, and I'll give you a spiritual rain spell after dinner." Zhang Yan's eyes, which had been frustrated by his failure to successfully release the spell, suddenly lit up. Having had enough to eat and drink, Sui'an planned to return to his spiritual field and study the technique of urging grass. At this moment, the old woman with a mole on her mouth stopped her directly. Sui'an glanced and found that the old woman's face was full of anger, as if she owed her 2 million yuan. However, it was none of her business, and she was too lazy to pay attention. She bypassed her and continued on. However, she didn't ask for trouble, and trouble automatically came to her. "Your name is Sui'an, isn't it? You have some skills, but this kind of exorbitant job is not something that you, as a newcomer, can handle." The old woman stepped forward to stop her and said in a lukewarm tone, "Extra fast." After reflecting for a while, Sui'an finally realized that the other party was talking about helping Zhang Yan cultivate wasteland. "Yes. Set the task in the first year, this is a benefit for us old monks. The so-called welfare is just a good thing to say. It's okay for Huayuan Valley to exploit them. What's wrong with someone who relies on their own qualifications and also wants to get involved?" When Sui'an settled down, he was smirked at by the other party. No matter what the old woman said, she walked straight towards her own spiritual field. Unexpectedly, the old woman pointed to her back and said, "You can't manage Zhang Yan's wasteland anymore." Taking it for granted, Sui'an stopped when he settled down. After sensing for a while, he realized that the other person, who looked older, was actually an old cultivator, who was still struggling to cultivate his energy. "Why can't I handle it? Breaking off one's financial path is like killing one's parents." Originally, her life was also tight, but now if she can make a living, she still has to be snatched away. She was just scraping by, and this old woman clearly wanted to directly share Zhang Yan's first year's earnings. The old woman was furious, but couldn't say a word, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Sui'an sneered, too lazy to talk to her again, and turned around to leave. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Spiritual Species. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Spiritual Seed. Hey. This little girl. No oil or salt in. The old woman glared fiercely at Sui'an, chopped her feet, and then reluctantly left. Sui'an carried a hoe on his shoulder and hummed a small tune all the way back to his own spiritual field. The young seedlings have grown taller one by one, and after being exposed to the sun, they become even more tender green. The morning rain on the leaf buds reflects a dazzling light. Almost every farmer must practice the techniques of spirit rain and blade resilience, which are the spells that must be used in planting spiritual plants. The spiritual field that has previously released the moisturizing earth technique seems to have a different color from others. Sui'an approached the 10 square meter spiritual field and found that there was indeed a faint spiritual energy rushing towards him. She quickly released another moisturizing technique and found that the color of the spiritual field had deepened a bit. Excited in his heart, a series of soil moistening techniques began to fill the 10 square meter spiritual field, until all the spiritual energy in his body was depleted. Only then did Sui'an smack his lips and begin to restore his spiritual energy. A shred of spiritual energy penetrated into her dantian, making her body warm and unable to help but spread out. Suddenly, she remembered that her cheap parents seemed to have left her a low-quality corn seed. She casually stuffed the seed into the spiritual field. Suddenly, the spiritual energy in this 10 square meter soil was quickly absorbed by the millet seeds. As she was about to harm the surrounding Puyang Grass, she quickly performed a spiritual rain technique. The corn seed only paused for a moment. Be good. No wonder it's just such a low-quality spirit rice seed, cheap parents still treat it as a treasure. She couldn't help but pursed her lips and kept releasing the moisturizing technique inside. It wasn't until her spiritual energy dried up again that she stopped, and the corn seed seemed to have eaten enough. She finally had time to calm down and flip through the last spell, the curse technique. As the name suggests, the technique of urging grass stimulates the growth of spiritual plants. The spiritual medicine and fruit that have been cultivated in the immortal world for hundreds and thousands of years may be lost before they mature. Sui'an pondered word by word, holding the magic formula in his hand and connecting it with a Puyang Grass. Until the sky darkened and there was a faint chirping of insects, the seedlings in front of Sui'an immediately absorbed the nutrients from the soil and rushed up to her knees. The tender green leaf buds kept swaying, forming a sharp contrast with the small tender buds elsewhere. Ding! Work hard to practice grass urging technique. Reward grass urging technique proficiency plus 1%, be good. She is really a genius. He released a spiritual rain spell on this Puyang Grass with his backhand, and Sui'an returned to the thatched cottage to meditate and practice. But I am already ecstatic in my heart. If there is no such thing as the urge grass technique, it is a skill that many spiritual medicine practitioners have been practicing. After all, it can shorten the growth time of Lingji, which may be even more useful for a poor person like her. It can make the Puyang Grass mature in advance, and the part sold belongs to her. After meditating for 2 hours, she felt that dantian couldn't absorb any more spiritual energy, so she had to stop. But the long night was long, and she couldn't sleep for that long in a day even though she had already practiced her energy, let alone use meditation as a substitute for sleep. Scrolling. Scrolling to death if it doesn't die. Sui'an clenched his fist and took the broken soul cultivation secret technique to the spiritual field. The first stage of the spiritual cultivation secret technique is incomplete, which only states that all things have spirits, and that spirits are used to nourish spirits, fill spiritual things, and condense spiritual things. Under the moonlight, she frowned and read repeatedly. She knew all the words, but when combined, she couldn't understand them at all. She looked around and saw nothing spiritual on her body except for a spiritual field and spiritual plants within it. With a pout, she took out a seed of Puyang Grass and slowly transported the spiritual energy inside. If you guessed correctly, the meaning of nourishing spirit with spiritual energy is to nourish spiritual objects with spiritual energy. Feeling a trace of spiritual energy transported in, Sui'an's whole heart lifted as he frantically darted through the seeds of Puyang Grass. Just when she thought the seed was about to explode, she didn't expect that wisp of spiritual energy to settle down. Integrate with seeds. There's a play. She released another strand of spiritual energy and transported it into the seed, but this time she didn't have such good luck. Bang! With the sound of explosions all over his body, Sui'an threw the seed directly out. She couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of water, and her heart was constantly puzzled. That's right. That's what the book says. For a moment, she couldn't help but doubt the correctness of this cultivation method, but the system has confirmed that this cultivation method is only incomplete, but it does not mean that it is written randomly. Sui'an frowned, sat down, took out some seeds, and challenged this technique. Without exception, all failed. At this moment, the millet seed absorbed spiritual energy again. She had intended to release a few soil moistening techniques, but with a sudden thought, she directly transported the spiritual energy into it. 1 strand, 2 strands, until 5 strands, this seed emitted a faint light. Ding! Congratulations to the host for having the first spiritual seed. Learn the soul-nourishing secret technique on your own. Reward proficiency of 1%, ding. Do you want to use a spiritual seed to repair the first level of soul-nourishing secret technique? Suddenly, segments of information from the first section of the soul-nourishing secret technique reached her mind. After recovering, she was overjoyed, and sure enough, this skill had a different response. In my past life, when reading novels, there were spiritual tools and elixirs with patterns. These are all referred to as spirits in this cultivation method. Sui'an carefully digested the information and repeatedly searched for the first level, soul-nourishing secret technique. Originally, the millet seed that had just been absorbed by the spirit-raising secret technique was the lowest level of spirit. Not even the thought appeared, let alone condensing one's true body and speaking out. However, the secret technique of nurturing spirits also makes it clear that during the qi cultivation period, only one spirit can be nurtured. She raised her eyebrows, thinking that since there is a limit on the quantity, it is crucial to choose what to cultivate and nurture spirits. To be honest, she is very inclined towards swords. Which of the predecessors in the past who crossed the cultivation world is not wielding a sword and wandering the rivers and lakes? Subsequently, her head instantly drooped, and her body's talent was very poor, and even her golden fingers tended to be lackluster. She's going to wave, probably not as lucky as those seniors. She pursed her lips and immediately set her sights on the 10 square meter spiritual field. Since all things have spirits, and I also have to farm, it doesn't seem too much to raise spirits from the spiritual field. Suddenly, Sui'an's mind became lively, and he chose this 10 square meter spiritual field to transport spiritual energy into it. Of course, unlike Puyang Grass and Lingmi seeds, this time she delivers entirely earthy spiritual energy. One is, Lingtian, isn't it just soil? In one, we need to stabilize. If we blow up the spiritual field of our sect, even if it's not mainstream, we'll have to lose everything. Moreover, she was so poor that she jingled. If the sect wanted to kill her, what was the difference between crushing an ant? End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Disaster or Human-Made Disaster. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Disaster or Human-Made Disaster. The sky suddenly appears, and roosters crow. Sui'an's eyes were red, and then he stopped. Ding! Congratulations to the host. 1 square meter of spiritual field has condensed into a spirit, rewarding 1% proficiency in the spirit cultivation secret technique. Her eyes were bloodshot, but she couldn't hide the brilliance in her eyes. She became. Feeling the lively appearance of this 1 square meter spiritual field, she became excited all over. Is this the beginning of spirituality? However, at a glance, she could tell that it was different from other spiritual fields, and she couldn't help but feel worried. The entire Lingtian of Huayuan Valley belongs to the Qingyang sect, and outsiders can still drive it away. Those who manage it and collect taxes, if they notice it, it will be a catastrophic disaster. Sui'an couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva and decided not to bother with this square meter of spiritual field anymore. But instead, he focused his attention on the techniques of urging grass and moistening soil. In a blink of an eye, a month passed. Realistic version of Happy Farm, host. Sui'an, Spirit Root. 5 Spirit Roots, miscellaneous, cultivation. Cultivate one layer of qi, practice. 5 elements cultivation decision, yellow level lower level. First level, 39% per 100%. Soul nourishing secret technique, top grade of the Xuanjie. Beginner to possess spirituality, 1% per 100%. Spells. Sharp resilience, proficient at 1% per 100%. Spirit rain, beginner at 12% per 100%. Illumination yang, beginner at 1% per 100%. Moisturizing earth, proficient at 9% per 100%. Urging grass, proficient at 16% per 100%, Lingtian. 5 acres without inflow, containing spiritual energy. 12% per 100%. 10 square meters of 9th grade spiritual field, containing 1/100% spiritual energy, seed spirit. Nun, Sui'an squinted her eyes, and under her diligent practice, her cultivation speed was countless times faster than her predecessors. And she has learned all the spells she can learn in her hand. It seems that selling this batch of Puyang Grass requires considering attack spells. She had long been craving the fireball technique and wanted to have another book of body forging technique. A 10 square meter 9th grade spiritual field can also be planted with some millet seeds or lower quality low-grade spiritual medicines. However, the withered pocket could only allow her to use some self-defense spells and corn seeds first. Sui'an once again released the urging grass technique to Lingtian by pinching the law in her hand. She tilted her chin up, it seemed that she could harvest it tomorrow and exchange it for the spirit stone. When she returned to the thatched cottage to meditate, 2 black shadows appeared at the border of Lingtian. How come this little girl's spiritual crops are rising so quickly? She won't learn the urge grass technique, will she? How could it be? It's probably the ripening potion left for her by her parents. Half a lifetime has passed, and the herding technique has just reached the threshold, it's impossible. After listening, the old woman countered incredulously. I hope what you're saying is true. You've agreed on a spirit stone for this batch of spirit insects. It looks like an old friend, I'll give you a 2nd level cold spirit insect. The old woman beside her hesitated for a moment, gritted her teeth and said, 1 spirit stone, 1 spirit stone. She has been helping Zhang Yan for a month now, and the newcomers around are eager to give it a try when they hear that she only manages food. Now that her spiritual crops are suffering, who dares to find her? The old man beside him looked at the woman's fierce face and felt a chill. However, in order to obtain the spirit stone that was about to be obtained, he still took out the spirit insect from the storage bag and threw it into the spirit field. The old woman nodded in satisfaction when she saw that the spirit beetle was like a locust passing by and began to nibble on the soon-to-mature cattail grass. Turning around and about to leave, the old man suddenly pulled her out. Are you not here to watch? What if that little girl directly kills these spiritual insects? Before he could finish speaking, the old woman impatiently patted his hand away. A little girl in her teens, even if she knows there's a spirit worm with her. Su Lao Hun. The older you get, the less daring you become. Old man Su blushed and tried to retort, but when he thought there was some truth, he didn't say more. The old woman looked at the other person's hesitant expression, definitely wanting the spirit insect to finish her work and put it away. She sneered, what are you afraid of? She doesn't have that ability. It's the same to come back tomorrow night to collect the spirit insect. After speaking, the old woman hooked her hand and Su Liahan's mind was instantly empty, his face revealing lewdness, leaving Sui'an's spiritual field. Sui'an was absorbing spiritual energy when he heard the rustling outside and couldn't help but frown. The chirping of insects on weekdays is not so loud, let alone so much noise. Tomorrow we will harvest the cattail grass, there must be no accidents today. With such thoughts in mind, she immediately got up and walked out. As soon as I went out, I found several bundles of yellowed Puyang grass with large gaps. Take a closer look, it's obvious that you've been bitten by insects. Ordinary insects eating a little spiritual grass will burst their stomachs with spiritual energy, burping their farts directly. Only spiritual insects can cause such a situation. Without much time to think, she sensed that one sharp and resilient technique and one spirit insect were all strangled. If it were a day earlier, her sharpness and resilience technique would still be in the beginner stage, so she might really have no choice but to deal with this kind of spirit insect. Coincidentally, her sharpness and resilience technique has reached the proficiency stage, and there is no problem solving these first-order spirit insects. But in the end, she saw a spirit worm the size of her palm, covered in frost all over her body. With exposed teeth, most of the Puyang grass that comes into contact with it has been frostbitten. Sui'an squinted his eyes. The first-level spirit beast is equivalent to the early stage of qi cultivation, and the second-level spirit beast is equivalent to the middle stage of qi cultivation. If it weren't for this kind of spirit insect with little combat power, she would likely have fallen directly into this. The sharp resilience technique was thrown down on this cold spirit insect, and with a chirping sound, she knew that the other party was angry. When the cold spirit insect rushed towards him, Sui'an rolled and dodged directly. She doesn't have any attack techniques, and the sharp resilience technique doesn't seem to have any effect. She's in a hurry, let's die and become a living horse doctor. After all, the Zhaoyang technique is a fire-type spell. She lifted a fist-sized aperture with warmth from her hand and directly hit the cold spirit insect. At this moment, Sui'an noticed that the cold spirit insect had a momentary pause. Effective. She was overjoyed in her heart and quickly released a few more illuminating yang spells towards the cold spirit insect. In an instant, the other party shrank into a ball, and she maintained the illuminating yang spell, continuously outputting spiritual energy. Suddenly, the cold spirit insect wilted and showed no signs of its initial madness. She couldn't help but pinch her hair formula and directly flipped the cold spirit insect over with one foot, revealing the weakest part of her abdomen. The carapace on the back is too hard, but the abdomen is much softer. She doesn't believe it's just this and can't split open. The sharp resilience technique seemed to flash a golden sharp blade, directly striking the abdomen of the cold spirit insect. Green blood splattered onto her gray robe. Mom! I killed someone. When Sui'an settled down, he breathed a sigh of relief and checked again that there were no spiritual insects in the spiritual field. He buried these pests directly in the 10 square meter 9th grade spiritual field. She clapped her hands and watched with satisfaction as a few strands of spiritual energy appeared in the 9th grade spiritual field. She then used the sunshine technique to restore the frostbitten Puyang Grass before returning to the thatched cottage. Like this kind of spiritual insect, they basically go to better spiritual fields. In a non-mainstream spiritual field like her, not to mention the cold spiritual insect, even the ordinary spiritual insect is not worth it. This is definitely not a simple disaster. It is highly likely to be human-made. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Ending harm to others and ending harm to oneself. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Harming others ultimately harms oneself. Inside a wooden house, the bed made a creaking sound. Sui'an's face was originally full of spring light, but suddenly a weak sweat broke out on his forehead and he got up. My cold spirit worm. The old woman looked puzzled and was about to hook her hand around the old man, but she was slapped in the face. You said that little girl doesn't have much ability. The cold spirit insect in my contract has died. After speaking, while putting on her pants, she viciously kicked the old woman a few more times. The old woman looked incredulous and said, What? She really has this ability. Suddenly, when she looked at Sui'an, her face was filled with fear, afraid of provoking this servant disciple who could contract the spirit insect again. In his 50s, Sui'an is not the kind of person who cannot see the situation clearly. A little girl in her teens can kill the cold spirit insect he has carefully cultivated. Not to mention how many achievements he can achieve in the future, as long as he can be a little stronger than him, it is also an existence that he cannot afford. Thinking of this, he also gave up the trouble he had just wanted to settle accounts with Sui'an and directly vented his anger on the old woman. The sound of fighting could be heard inside the house. The old woman had been farming all her life, and even though she was a bit of a spiritual stone, she had not practiced it well. All of it was used to repair her appearance, which made her look charming even at the age of 50 or 60. "That's great, I was beaten half to death by old man Su." The old woman immediately felt extremely regretful in her heart. She had known that she had let him guard the spiritual field, and insisted on saving so much spiritual stone. Sui'an, who was practicing in his own thatched cottage, didn't know that Zhang Yan's neighbor was having a big show now. Just practicing on her own, she was tricked by someone this time. Puyang Grass was about to mature, and she didn't dare to sleep anymore. She sat cross-legged in the room and guarded it. The next day, it wasn't dawn yet. The Puyang Grass outside emitted spiritual energy one by one, which was a symbol of maturity. Sui'an was overjoyed and immediately swung his sickle, which had released the sharp and resilient technique, towards the root. It wasn't until noon that she put this batch of Puyang Grass in the storage bag. There weren't as many seeds left of Puyang Grass, so she had to plant half of it with Puyang Grass and the other half with chestnut grass. Holding the technique, white clouds condensed with spiritual energy appeared in the sky. Rainwater containing spiritual energy sprinkled down, and newly planted Puyang Grass and Mali Grass sprouted one bud after another. She nodded in satisfaction and walked down the mountain. However, this time she is not going to the market, but to the local market at the foot of Huayuan Valley Mountain. The difference between Fengshe and Jishe is one word, but there is a difference. Jishe is the territory of the sect, and most of them are also disciples of the sect, with very few scattered cultivators. But Fengshe is a hodgepodge, with disciples from various sects, scattered cultivators, and even other disciples from other sections. She dare not go to the market, and the whole Huayuan Valley is in the same breath. If she sells it to the market, she will definitely buy it at the price of the sect. Even if it's setting up a stall, don't be fooled. The market is just such a big place, and the people wandering around are usually farmers like her. Apart from Lingmi, there is also a market, and everything else can be sold out in about 10 days. Of course, these are all memories of the original body, and the parents of the original body always go to the local market to sell the remaining spiritual crops. Although it's only 1 to 2% more expensive than the market price, that's also a spirit stone. Let's go. I can't afford to pay for my cold spirit worm, can I? If I sell it to the kiln, I'll have money to pay for it. An old man grabbed an old woman's arm and angrily said. Cold spirit insect. In an instant, Sui'an felt a chill. Yesterday, she also stole her Puyang Grass from the cold spirit insect. In addition, the chubby yet charming old woman in front of her was the one who stopped her and said she was stealing business. No wonder this old man is dragging her to compensate for the cold spirit insect now. It turns out he has committed his own wrongdoing and cannot survive. Of course, Sui'an only glanced at it. Yesterday was just a guess in his heart, not yet certain, and now the truth is right in front of him. Seeing her harm others and ultimately harm herself, Sui'an couldn't help but feel proud and angry. But the next scene really startled her chin. Sui'an. Sui'an. Help me. The old woman, whose hair was being pulled, saw that Sui'an's eyes lit up and ignored her, directly seeking her help. Why? Sui'an raised his eyebrows and said. The old woman was pulling her hair and let out a painful sound, but still wanted to move towards her. Your Puyang Grass has matured, please compensate him first, and I will return it to you in the future. Sui'an couldn't help but laugh at the old woman's naughty behavior again. What the hell? You haven't accounted for the trouble you caused me with Puyang Grass yet. Now you're licking your face and asking me to help you compensate for the cold spirit insect. She cast a gloomy glance at Su Laohan and noticed that he had practiced 3 layers of qi. She suppressed her desire to question yesterday's words, cursed angrily, and quickly left. As soon as she left, the old woman's heart turned cold and she also cursed and said, "Old man Su. I am a disciple of Qingyang's sect. How dare you move me with your first-level scattered cultivation?" Li Sui'an, who had walked away, turned around and noticed that Su Liahan's figure had paused. He was obviously hesitant, but then he pulled on the old woman again. "Debt repayment. It's natural." She shook her head and stepped into the Lingbao Pavilion established by Qingyang's sect in Fengshe. As soon as I entered, I knew that the Lingbao Pavilion here was many times better than the Lingbao Pavilion in the market. There are all kinds of techniques, spells, talismans, elixirs, arrays, and magical tools, except for those that Li Sui'an doesn't know, and none that she hasn't seen before. The shopkeeper behind the counter looked at Li Sui'an, who had never seen the world before, and felt a wave of disdain in his heart. He said coldly, "Friend, what do you need?" She didn't care either and asked directly, "Do you want to harvest the cattail spirit grass? As long as the quality is up to standard, Lingbao Pavilion will accept everything." This statement is a bit absurd. The general meaning is that as long as your item is not a waste pill or tool, it can be collected, and even some high-level waste pills will be collected. Li Sui'an pursed his lips, smiled slightly, patted the storage bag, and in an instant, the first floor of the Lingbao Pavilion was filled with bundles of Puyang Grass. The shopkeeper raised his eyes and said, "About 50 bundles, the quality is decent, 20 inferior spirit stones." 20. The output of 1 acre of land is only 4 spirit stones, which is 1 more than the Lingbao Pavilion in the market. Without hesitation, Li Sui'an agreed and the shopkeeper remained silent. He took out 20 spirit stones and placed them on the counter, collecting the Puyang Grass. Seeing that she had not taken the spirit stone at all, but looked around, the shopkeeper changed his face and smiled, "Friend, do you need some cultivation resources?" The voice is calm, but it's much better than the initially cold attitude. "This business has come, how could you still lose face? Even the smallest mosquito is still meat." Li Sui'an raised his eyebrows and said, "Boss. I want to see some body forging techniques and attack spells." The shopkeeper glanced at Li Sui'an's small figure, pushed his hand, and directly took down several martial arts books from the shelf. "This is Fireball technique. This is Qingyang Shaojian technique, and this is." These are all spells with high attack power, and they can be learned quickly. As for the forging body technique. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Fanpu flower species. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Fanpu flower seed. The shopkeeper glanced at her and then said, "Don't blame me for talking too much, Taoist friend. This forging technique is not something that ordinary people can practice, and ordinary forging techniques have little effect. Not much effect." Li Sui'an frowned slightly and bowed, "Excuse me, senior, what are the details here?" After speaking, he pushed a spirit stone from the counter in front of the other person. The shopkeeper glanced left and right and immediately put the spirit stone into his arms, whispering, "I suggest that you should ascend to the outer gate as soon as possible." Just like any other martial arts in the Qingyang sect Sutra Pavilion, they are also dozens of times better than these. Oh. Look at this book, at most it's just about refining one's physical body. Even if it's perfected, it's only slightly stronger than a cultivator of the same level at most. The shopkeeper took out a booklet and handed it over, with a price tag of 2 spirit stones. Li Sui'an casually flipped through it and found that it was the technique used by ordinary people to practice their bodies. "I can't help but feel disappointed in my heart. Becoming an outer gate is extremely difficult. Generally, talented individuals are only recruited into the outer gate. If lucky, it is possible to enter the inner gate in the eyes of a golden elixir elder." However, Li Sui'an still has a good understanding of his own qualifications, and his talent is average, so he can only use the most common methods. Within the age of 50, one can enter the later stage of qi cultivation and become an external disciple, successfully building a foundation and becoming an internal disciple. Why don't you choose to enter the inner and outer doors based on your qualifications? Are you joking? It doesn't cost much to conduct precise tests. You can tell whether it's a dragon or a phoenix as soon as you practice. Why bother spending that wasted money again? Only those disciples of the cultivation family who can test their spiritual roots with spirit stones, without exception, basically enter the inner and outer gates. Those with poor qualifications would not be chosen by the family to enter the sect for cultivation. The shopkeeper glanced at Li Sui'an's expression and immediately understood, ahem. However, if I can find a good practice technique for the young friend, that's the price. A hint of surprise flashed in Li Sui'an's heart, but he immediately realized it. I couldn't help but sneer in my heart. It turned out that the other party was willing to say so much to her, just to make money. The Qingyang sect's martial arts cannot be passed down externally, but if you use a drop of essence and blood to prove who needs it, you can also help obtain it. This is also the way her cheap parents once entrusted someone to obtain the 5 cultivation techniques in the Sutra Pavilion. Apart from the Spirit Rain technique and the Sharp Resilience technique, there are still 3 remaining spells. Including other farmers, they were only given free Spiritual Rain and Sharp Resilience spells by the sect, as well as the basic cultivation method, 5 elements cultivation technique. Boss, the price is not a problem. She waved her hand, but did not show any urgency. The shopkeeper immediately smiled and said, this is a booklet that can be exchanged for martial arts. Please take a look and pay the deposit in advance. Leave a drop of essence and blood, and you can collect it in a month. After Li Sui'an took over, he found that most of them were yellow-level martial arts. However, there were very few Xian-level martial arts, and even there were not many top-grade Huang-level martial arts, which was the foundation of the sect. How could you give them these muddy legs? Li Sui'an flipped over and suddenly his eyes flashed. The Longevity Sutra, with just 3 words, gave her a strong boost. Isn't practicing for the sake of immortality. But the next second, she also knew why this skill only belonged to the lower level of the yellow rank. The reason still lies in its incompleteness, but the incompleteness of a martial arts technique also allows the sect to belong to the lower level of the yellow rank, rather than the rotten street, which also demonstrates its value. Li Sui'an raised his eyebrows, not afraid of being incomplete. She is a woman who has been cheating, repairing it would be a peerless skill. She smiled as she looked at the 20 lower-grade spirit stones marked by this cultivation method. After flipping through spells and the like again, she realized that fireball and lightning strikes were not included in the cultivation. She couldn't help but ask, isn't this an attack spell? The shopkeeper paused slightly, thinking that Li Sui'an, who is also a farmer at this age, probably had no one to share common sense with her. These simple spells are generally not difficult to learn as long as you improve your cultivation level, and the casting time in the beginner stage is relatively long, making it inconvenient to fight. However, precision cultivation is quite difficult. After years of hard work, there may not be a talisman that is more effective. Li Sui'an nodded secretly. Indeed, during the battle, if you were casting spells and someone threw a pile of talismans to deal with you, it would be better to take a big knife and directly attack. She fixed her gaze on a low-level bow technique in the yellow rank, and once she mastered it, she could transform her spiritual energy into arrows. This is great. Suitable for her. Remote attacks are more suitable for her to endure. However, the swordsmanship on the side also caught her eye, and these few martial arts require 50 spirit stones. It's not something she can afford at all. She could only point to the Longevity Sutra and Long Moon Arrow technique and say, boss. It's just 2 different things. Thank you very much for helping me clarify today. After speaking, she bowed her hand. It's okay. Our cultivators, it's also a good thing to enhance our strength more. A total of 20 spirit stones deposit. After speaking, he gestured for Sui'an to take out another spirit stone. She couldn't help but curse inwardly, earning quite a bit. We still need to search for her thoroughly. She took out the remaining 500 spirit beads from the storage space and said, "Boss. Connect with everyone. That's all." The shopkeeper's thick eyebrows slightly furrowed and he said, "Friend, it's not that I'm not ungrateful, it's really a small business. However, seeing that your Puyang Grass also has a yield of 5 acres, I believe you must have learned the technique of urging grass. I have a seed of a spiritual medicine, and if you can help me plant it, not to mention 500 spiritual beads, I will paste the final payment for you." After speaking, Sui'an took out a spiritual medicine seed and glanced at it, only to find that it was on the brink of death. "If it can't be planted. If you can't grow it, it's okay. Just pay the remaining balance." Sui'an gritted his teeth and took it directly, without any loss. As she walked out of the Lingbao pavilion, she let out a soft sigh and said, "Oh, I really didn't get anything, so I threw all the month's hard work into it. It seems that we still need to go grab a meal, but most of those poor children can still release their spiritual rain skills, and the way to grab a meal is also blocked. There are also some ordinary broken silver in the storage bag. It seems that we need to be frugal this month." Inside the Lingbao pavilion, the shopkeeper watched as Sui'an walked away, shook his storage bag, and his face suddenly smiled. Puyang Grass, either a 9th-grade spiritual field or a non-mainstream spiritual field, has a farmer who knows how to promote grass cultivation. I don't know if it's possible to value Fanpu's flower seeds. If they do, at least 100 spirit stones will be earned. Practice 1 layer of qi, and don't dare to publicize your planting talent too much. You can earn some money in the future. Thinking of this, he sat on a rattan chair behind the counter and took out a book called Miscellaneous Records of Immortal Cultivation to flip through. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. 10 Lower Grade Lingtian. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Lower Grade Lingtian Huayuan Valley. Sui'an sat next to the Lingtian and couldn't help but smack his mouth. "This ordinary rice is really not as delicious as Lingmi," he said, thinking of 2 techniques to enhance her strength and save her life. She didn't think much anymore, but took out the Fanpu flower seed. That shopkeeper's plan was as planned. Who would have thought that after leaving the Lingbao pavilion, she made several rounds and went to the Lingyao pavilion. Although this is a small shop, the quality of pills and the quantity of spiritual herbs cannot be compared to the Lingbao pavilion under the Qingyang sect. They are engaged in a price war. The effect is not good. The advantage lies in our affordability. Generally, those who are a bit impoverished will buy elixirs at the Spirit Medicine Pavilion. She asked, and only then did she know that this was a Fanpu flower seed, and the finished product could sell 100 spirit stones. Commonly used for refining second-level nourishing pills. The second-level nourishing pill is usually only taken by cultivators during the foundation building period, and the price is also expensive. A bottle of 10 pills sells 300 spirit stones. However, Fanpu flower seeds are the main material, and high prices are quite normal. After all, profits are also high. However, the spiritual energy of this seed is scattered outside, and the probability of planting it is extremely low. Sui'an was playing with the Fanpu flower seeds in her hand. If she directly planted the seeds in the 9th-grade spiritual field, it would be difficult to plant them. She held her breath and focused her mind, and the first layer of the soul-nourishing secret technique began to have spirituality in her body. The spiritual energy of the wood attribute is continuously input into the Fanpu flower seeds, and the spiritual energy inside the seeds gradually becomes full. The day alternates. Ding! Congratulations to the host for successfully owning a spiritual seed. Ding! Congratulations to the host. Proficiency plus 1% in soul-nourishing secret technique. Sui'an stared blankly at Fanpu Huazhong, who clearly had spiritual energy in his hand and was full of spiritual energy, and couldn't help but exhale softly. She just wants to try repairing this expensive seed. I didn't expect it to really happen. She quickly planted the Fanpu flower and watered it with Lingyu, not worried about being discovered. She also planted some chestnut grass on the side. I just returned to my room and started practicing. The next day, she was weeding in the field and practicing herding techniques. After several attempts to promote the seedlings and nourish them with the spiritual rain technique, the Puyang Grass and Mali grass in the spiritual field have surprisingly risen to the same level as Zhang Yan and the others. Just as she was overjoyed, Zhang Yan's hurried cries came from a distance. Sui'an sister. Sui'an sister. After Zhang Yan stopped, he was panting heavily. Li Sui'an quickly gave him a spoonful of water condensed from the spirit rain technique. That's when I finally calmed down. Sister Sui'an. Old lady, the old lady next to me has disappeared. I heard she was robbed by Sanxiu. Li Sui'an raised an eyebrow, and naturally knew where the old woman was. She probably had already practiced the stove cauldron technique by now. You don't know yet. The steward of the outer gate of Huayuan Valley directly found the scattered cultivator, and with one palm, he split open the opponent's spiritual cover. But the old woman has no trace. This approach really made Li Sui'an give a thumbs up. A miscellaneous disciple is not worthy of the upper sect's money and effort to search. Even if they know where she is, they may not go out to rescue her. Most likely, the old woman claimed to be a disciple of the Qingyang sect, which made the people in the neighborhood laugh. The external steward came forward to quell this matter. Li Sui'an raised his eyebrows and said, "The steward said she went missing." Zhang Yan shook her head and said with an unpleasant expression, "The steward said she's dead, but I think she's alive." She couldn't help but look up at Zhang Yan, and while working, she said, "That old woman is not a good person either. If she dies, she will die." After listening, Zhang Yan couldn't help but nod. Li Sui'an raised his eyes and smiled, "Is this the only thing that makes you so anxious? Is there anything else to do? Sister Sui'an still knows me well. I heard that several spiritual cultivators in the lower grade spiritual field have passed away. The external steward said he wants to select a few of us farmers to plant the lower grade spiritual field." Zhang Yan's face revealed a deep longing. The saying goes, 1 carrot, 1 pit. There are only so many spiritual fields in Huayuan Valley, and the number of spiritual fields with rich spiritual energy is also limited. Unless the cultivators of their own spiritual fields are eliminated, or the taxes owed to the sect are overdue, or there are people with truly skilled farming techniques, there will be no replacement. Moreover, most farmers who can plant inputs are at least 3 layers of gas cultivation. If one has outstanding talent and the 5 cultivation methods have all entered the stage of small success, then it is true that one has achieved success through farming. Become an official outer disciple of the sect. Li Sui'an pursed his lips. If he could really enter the spiritual field of planting, he would earn even more in a month. At that time, there will be no need to plant worthless things like Puyang Grass. You can plant spiritual rice and even spiritual fruits. There will also be more resources for cultivation. Are there any conditions? Since it's a selection, there must be standards. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment and said, "I don't know, but cultivators who plant inferior spiritual fields are all in the middle stage of qi cultivation, and all the 5 cultivation techniques are in the proficient stage. However, we non-mainstream individuals rarely meet this standard." Li Sui'an nodded and pinched the tip, she understood. Among the underperforming students, there are inevitably a few who perform slightly better in their studies. When will the competition take place? Listen to others say after the start of spring. Sui'an sister. I think you can do it. After speaking, he looked at Li Sui'an sincerely. She raised her eyebrows and secretly made a decision to work harder to cultivate. The benefits of planting in a spiritual field are truly tempting upon careful consideration. Leaving aside everything else, the tax revenue has also increased from 70% to 60%. Even if 10% is stolen by the authorities, there is still 30%. Li Sui'an squinted his eyes and patted Zhang Yan's shoulder. Thank you. After Zhang Yan left, she carefully took care of this Fanpu flower. However, this 10 square meter 9th grade spiritual field really makes her head bigger. Although others may not notice it usually, if she really enters the entry-level spiritual field through selection, then this 10 square meter lower grade spiritual field will naturally be discovered. However, she couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief when she thought that the soil moistening technique in the 5 cultivation methods did indeed have this effect. But I still plan to practice the soil moistening technique and not just release it in this area. It's too eye-catching. Next, she releases the moisturizing earth technique every day and changes to a different spiritual field to ensure that each side of the land is similar. However, with the use of the spirit rain technique and the addition of the foraging technique, the demand has also increased. She has reduced the watering range of the spirit rain technique and increased its frequency of use. A month later, Li Sui'an looked at the colorful Fanpu flower and peeled off the rest of the spiritual grass, which emitted a strong spiritual energy. For a whole month, her focus was entirely on this Fanpu flower. If it weren't for the goal of ripening it as soon as possible, and with her upcoming proficiency in level of herding and spiritual rain techniques, it is estimated that the second batch of spiritual crops would have been planted early. She pulled out Fanpu and brought some spiritual soil, carefully placing it in the storage bag. I just started harvesting Puyang grass and chestnut grass. End of this chapter.